I think it's about time to get started. Thank you all for joining the mini conference today. I'm going to introduce our two eminent speakers, Corinne Kath and Michael Viel. But first I want to express my gratitude to ACES, which is the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, and ARTIS, the Amsterdam School for Regional, Transnational and European Studies. I don't quite know what the difference is. It's both about European studies, but I also want to thank Niels ten Oever's Critical Infrastructure Lab at the UvA. And this event is part of the ACES series of geopolitics of technology. So there will be more debates following in this series. I'm going to first introduce the two speakers and then give you an overview of the program today. So Dr. Corinne Kath is an anthropologist of internet infrastructure. And she currently works as a postdoc at the University of Delft with Dr. Seda Gürses. Corinne is part of the NWO consortium studying public values in the algorithmic society, also known as AlgoSoc. Corinne is a research fellow at the UvA's Critical Infrastructure Lab and a research associate at the Cambridge Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy. That's Corinne. She's going to start, but first I'm going to introduce Dr. Michael Viel. He's an associate professor in digital rights and regulation and vice dean at the University College in London at the Faculty of Law. Michael's research focuses on how to understand and address challenges of power and justice created and exacerbated by digital technologies. And Michael specializes in privacy-enhancing technology and machine learning. So what are we going to do today? My name, by the way, is Shuranas. I was kindly invited to chair. The past 5 years I've been negotiating privacy-friendly contracts for the government and universities with big tech. But Corinne and Michael are going to talk me out of a job today. It's entirely useless to worry about data protection and personal data surveillance. But I'm looking forward to your input for my new career after this. Anyway, so first Corinne will speak for about 20 minutes, and then Michael will speak for about 20 minutes. And I try to end this panel at 6:15. So almost the last half hour are for your questions. And I just have to warn you that I'm a pretty strict moderator. So if you're planning to present your life's history and your life's philosophy disguised as a question, I'm going to brutally interrupt you. One more thing about the content of today's panel. So today's panel has quite a controversial title. I prefer to call it Are Data Dead? I love Latin, so I don't understand why data is. But Corinne will explain how the power dynamics are shifting from platforms to owners of global infrastructure. And Corinne will also explain that we focus way too much on the risks of surveillance through personal data exploitation. Instead, in the brave new world, we should focus on the owners of infrastructure because they can even commercially exploit encrypted data. After that, Michael will focus on the new oligopoly of the owners of, for example, personal devices. Michael is going to tell us, shatter our dreams that Apple is a good company, basically. He will explain why Apple's privacy by design measures may look very benign, but have a very undesirable outcome of market consolidation. So the floor is yours, Corinne.
Thank you so much, everyone. I also love how the first concern that we've collectively picked up on is one of grammar. It's a good way to start. I also want to start off with a warning, which is I'm nursing the end of a terrible cold. So bear with me as I occasionally look at my notes and or take a sip of water to make sure that I remain audible. So data is dead. Or is it? Earlier this week, we saw Reddit, the infamous online forum, announce that it will license a decade of its user-generated content to, at the beginning of the week, an unnamed AI company that we now know as Google. And the data will be used for the purpose of training its various AI systems. So not necessarily, or at least not explicitly, also to, for instance, generate detailed profiles of users or serve them ads. And we've also seen other reporting this week coming out that indicates that Apple has freed up quite a substantial budget to partner with various media companies to use their content for AI training. And OpenAI, another well-known name, has been very public in its efforts to create licensing deals for access to data of media outlets and publishers. So, do we look silly or what, claiming here that data is dead? Or are we wrong? Well, I think it's somewhere in the middle. There is a shift happening from how money is made on the internet, from selling data and using it to serve ads to individual users. And now we see more of a business-to-business dynamic where companies are building data or buying data or licensing data for completely different purposes. So is data dead? Yes and no. It might not be dead, but its role in the tech sector is definitely changing. And we need to understand this change in the context of evolving business dynamics that are going on. That see, in my particular area of the world, internet infrastructure, such as servers, networks, cloud computing, become increasingly important. And what we see is that this shift allows the companies that control particular facets of this infrastructure to leverage the advantage of data towards their business purposes, sometimes even in new ways, that raise questions beyond the ones that we are usually concerned about, like individual privacy or data protection or online surveillance. And the question then is for all of us, because this is also an attempt at a conversation and not us having some sort of hold over the truth, so to speak. How do we research these changing dynamics and put them on the radar for policymakers and the advocates and the activists that I know are also in the room? Well, one of the ways is to look at infrastructure here in bold. Because power dynamics in tech are linked to the ownership and operation of critical infrastructure of the internet. Again, like cloud computing, like data centers, like networks. And in my talk, I will focus primarily on internet infrastructure and cloud computing, which is what I'm most comfortable with. And Michael will take a stab at protocols and phones. And what we see when we look at, for instance, cloud computing is that conveniently, this sector is dominated by some of the existing behemoths in tech, so Google, AWS, and Microsoft. And that means that to understand the power in the contemporary wired world, we must really closely look at the changing business dynamics of how its underlying infrastructure is organized. Who owns this infrastructure? So things like cloud computing or content delivery networks when it comes to the internet. Who operates it? What new leverage does that give them over the data that they have access to? And what is this infrastructure subsequently used for? What is its purpose? And to answer some of these questions, or perhaps raise more questions still, I'm going to be looking backwards towards my PhD research, where I looked at what or how human rights organizations in particular are working alongside corporate engineers in very technical fora to help them understand the implications of their technological choices on a variety of outcomes. And also how this work and the repertoires that human rights organizations usually work with, which are deeply grounded in notions of individual privacy, data protection, anti-surveillance, pro-encryption, etc., end up falling short in many ways in the current business and political economy of technology, where many different aspects of key infrastructure are in the hands of only a few number of companies. And this particular PhD research really piqued my interest in cloud computing as an inevitable sort of gateway through which anyone else who wants to do anything on the internet, whether you're a consumer or a business or a government, had to sort of go. And in doing so, I'm going to be drawing from a book that I edited and published that came out of my PhD, called Eaten by the Internet. It's published by Meatspace Press, and you can find a free link of it on the internet. And Michael also provided a wonderful chapter to the book from which I'll be drawing some insights. But I'm also going to be looking forward a little bit and share some initial things that I'm working on right now in my current role as a postdoc at the University of Delft, where I have the pleasure of working with Dr. Seda Gürses and her Programmable Infrastructures group, some of whom are in the room, which I'm very grateful for. And in that capacity, I'm going to be looking at the future of the internet under the pressure of the cloud. So what is my role here today? I'm going to give a bit of a bigger overview of what it means for power to shift to infrastructure based on my own research and based on some of the research of the people who contributed their wonderful chapters to the book. And the book is quite expansive in its approach to infrastructure, even more expansive than the ways in which Michael and I will be talking about it, in the sense that people cover everything from the interstellar internet ambitions of AWS to the colonial legacy of telecommunications, infrastructure in the Philippines, to what it means to do data infrastructure walks here in Amsterdam, as the Critical Infrastructure Lab does, to make the invisible visible. But what I really try to do, and what I hope this conversation also will do, is open up the world of infrastructure and show the ways in which it's murky at this point. I mean, one of the problems with infrastructure is that we don't always realize that it's there, or even when we do, we don't always see things that behave as infrastructure. Like, for instance, our phones, as Michael will go into. And second is that some of the dynamics that we highlight tonight are very much happening in the arena of business-to-business relations, or what I'll later in the slide call business-to-business brawls between different companies, rather than them being directly consumer-facing, which means it's much harder to see what's going on and it's much harder to understand the dynamics at play. So, bringing this back to the title of the paper, or the panel, it's not that data is entirely relevant. It's just that its ability to focus as a locus of power is rapidly changing in the reality of today's world and in the reality of the business practices that are predominant. And this means we can't really look at data in the same way anymore, or at least not see it as held in some way outside of its infrastructural context. And that change is important for us to highlight, no matter what kind of a perspective you are working on these topics from. And I think seeing infrastructure clearly is incredibly hard, but doing it well will affect our ability to regulate big tech, to hold tech companies to account, to advocate and to mobilize around these issues. And I think this is one of the things that Michael and I very distinctly agree on, even if we maybe have separate focuses in our research, or even if there's some difference of opinion between us in terms of what a good regulatory approach for the future might look like, or how to make sure that Shura stays gainfully employed. So there are a number of examples, and Michael will go into these as well, where we can see the changing impact of infrastructure on power dynamics. And that's privacy-enhancing technologies, which are essentially technologies aimed at protecting privacy, supposedly to limit power inequalities that we know arise from data collection and surveillance. And during my PhD research, this particular topic and how to position yourself as a human rights advocate vis-a-vis privacy-enhancing technologies came up very, very frequently. And what I saw is that some of the activists that I worked with over my fieldwork initially took these very sort of pro-privacy stances, like more encryption, always good. Devising ways to make surveillance harder, always good. But over the span of my fieldwork, and I spent about 10 years in total in this organization, but 3 years as part of my PhD fieldwork, they became increasingly wary, worried, and aware of the dangers of power consolidation that all of these technologies on the internet led to. So yes, it's a good thing, supposedly, when your browsers have better encryption, but at the same time, being able to run those kind of schemes is only accessible to a limited number of big companies who already own the infrastructure, who control it, and who have the computational capacity to even do it. So being pro-privacy, in their case, often meant also supporting technologies that would lead to consolidation in the field. And here you are. And so two of my favorite thinkers, Michael and Siobhan Kal Sahib, make a very similar argument along these lines in the book. And pets as a topic, and the dangers of pets is obviously a field that many scholars have worked on for a very long time, way predating the work that I've ever done, including Seda Gürses and Carmela Troncoso. And also some of the folks that are sitting in the audience here from my group at Delft did a really interesting workshop on this topic at Privacy Camp organized by EDRI. And I think if you Google it, you should be able to find it. It's called great. Michael has a link in his slides. We are so attuned. This is wonderful. Privacy as big business. So what does this tell us? Nothing is simple. In the current reality of the political economy of tech, where a limited number of companies control a vast swath of critical internet infrastructure, like aforementioned operating systems, cloud computing facilities, networks, etc., none of the solutions are easy necessarily. And it's only a handful of companies, and it's no coincidence that it's only a small number of companies that can leverage encryption or other technologies in this particular way, because, as I already mentioned, having the infrastructure and being able to deploy thousands of servers across the world and running these technologies is incredibly expensive. And it's only the big companies that own and operate major infrastructure at scale for the internet. So what we see is while these efforts are incredibly important for privacy in one way, the reliance on the expansive infrastructure in which they are implemented has the effect of making them deployable only by large tech sectors. Or in other words, what we're seeing is that these companies are able to rebuild power through their grasp on the infrastructure. And so Michael has a couple of lovely quotes on this in the book. I'm going to skip those, so in the I don't want to be yelled at by Shura in the interest of time. And so what does this mean for us? It means that only a small number of companies have sort of the holy trinity of technical, social, political, and financial resources to make these kind of to deploy these kind of privacy-enhancing technologies or to make these major licensing deals with different outlets. And that tends to further bolster their already pretty extensive power. And again, as mentioned, these are very familiar names. And I can also see some of the writing on the wall when it comes to these dynamics in my own research, which sort of sits at the intersection of internet governance, anthropology, and cloud computing. Because we do see that, in particular, cloud computing companies are changing how the internet works. We see instead of a diverse set of networks connecting to each other as the internet was initially set up, we see that increasingly Google is providing or taking on some of these services in terms of using their global network of data centers connecting to each other, or AWS's data centers connecting to each other, rather than a diverse network of networks. And so even the internet's functioning and role is changing under the growing importance of these limited number of infrastructural players. I'm not the first scholar to look at this. Volker Stocker and Todd Arnold have also done really interesting, and Jeff Houston have done really interesting work what this means for internet traffic and connectivity, and how these are organized both technically and culturally. And so what we're seeing, or at least the things that I'm trying to figure out, is how is the public internet changing in response to all of these dynamics? And is that for the better or not? And what would that look like? So, our societies are increasingly beholden to a smaller number of companies. These companies are rebuilding their power around infrastructure and the hold that they have over this infrastructure, which in turn allows them to leverage that strength in ways that can actually undermine some of the good that can be done through encryption or privacy or data protection or anti-surveillance or any of these tools that we tend to have in our toolkit. And these are some of the dynamics that we wanted to put front and center in the debate today. Now, I'll skip this one for now, but what does this mean for our practice, and how do we collectively engage this complex reality? especially for those who are in policy or advocacy positions. Like, we need that level of nuance in the debate. Otherwise, what ends up happening, this is what Michael has seen in his work, this is what I've seen in my PhD work, this is what I know some of the folks in the room have seen in their work. If you don't do that, what you end up having is a very real risk of legitimate protection of certain rights, expression, privacy, etc., becoming supportive of questionable business practices that at their core are used to consolidate corporate power through infrastructure. Now, here we are, wicked problem. When we say data is dead, or when I say data is dead, sorry, are dead, yeah. I'm getting to my last slide.
No, you have time.
Oh, I have time. it's just the grammar.
Phone a little further away.
A little further away. Better? Thank you. So if we say data is dead, that doesn't mean there's no relevance, that it retains no relevance in the political economy of tech. Although I know that Michael's actually prepared a talk in which he will actually make the argument that data is irrelevant under certain infrastructural parameters. But what it does mean is that the asymmetry in power between us and tech companies is not necessarily or primarily one of data asymmetries. And this is a point that the lead of the research group that I work with, Seda Gürses, always reminds us of to understand this. Where does it leave us, though? So these insights, to a certain extent, require a shift in how we approach advocacy. What if we can't simply be pro-privacy or pro-encryption anymore, as a topic that I saw many of the activists in my fieldwork struggle with? What if it's not so easy to discern anymore what it means to be on the side of the good guys, so to speak, given how these stances also tend to align with the interests of big infrastructure companies? How do we approach regulation if the internet's functioning increasingly relies on the private backbones of cloud computing companies? How do we make sure our governments can hold big tech to account when they're all too eager to hoist all of their digital infrastructure to corporate US clouds? Etc., etc. How do we move beyond unhelpful thinking about digital sovereignty or popular pie in the sky thinking about how we can just like out-public procure the US tech sector in Europe? These are all open questions and also ones that I'm very excited to hear Michael and Shura's perspectives on as people who've actually taken these companies to court. As well as many of the people and the experts in the audience that I see here from my SPAV at 25 pulpit. So that brings me to my last slides. Yes, how annoying. I've left you with perhaps more questions than answers. And the easy route would be to say, like, well, that's my job. I'm a researcher. I provide a lay of the land. I nuance, etc., etc. But I'm also a very reluctant academic, someone who comes from a more activisty background. And so the real honest answer is that I'm not sure there is a singular or an easy way out from under the dynamics that I've sketched. But to end on a positive note, and to perhaps go a little bit full circle on my talk, I am very happy for other panelists and people in the audience to tell us that we're wrong, that we're right, or that we simply look silly. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks all for coming. My title is similar to Corinne's, although I also acknowledge that her phrasing of my own work was much better than I could possibly do. Data is dead, perhaps within certain infrastructural parameters, and also depending what we mean by data. And so I've subtitled this on the power to orchestrate devices, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. And perhaps a little bit about why data might be a bit of a red rag that's being held up to legislators who are rushing to try and diffuse power through taking aim at data, piles of data. And if they get close, again, under certain infrastructural parameters, they might find this rag pulled away and have to recalibrate their efforts to a much trickier problem in many ways. And we'll outline what that looks like, and hopefully with the help of everyone in the room, figure out what to do about it. So the first slide here is a set of quotes from the Digital Markets Act in Recital 3. Very, very boring, apologies. But the reason I put this up is because it illustrates how a large amount of recent lawmaking that is meant to be the kind of cutting-edge lawmaking, taking aim at power in the digital economy, has a lot of built-in assumptions. For example, that access to data is a key input in the digital economy, and perhaps removing that access to data will then diffuse that power. Now, you don't see this written in a single part, but you see it littered throughout in the way that laws are written, in the way that rights are constructed, in the way that enforcement is envisaged, and through a variety of acts, including the Data Governance Act, the Data Act, and indeed in part the data protection laws around the world, including the GDPR in Europe. And these assumptions look pretty banal, pretty inane, pretty simple, but in fact, they're not what we could call technologically neutral. There is an assumption that when people try and make laws in the 21st century governing technology, that they should be technologically neutral. You shouldn't make a law about a certain technology. You should go back and think about some of the principles and make sure that your law would withstand some developments in that field. And the point that I think we're making by saying that data is dead is exactly what Corinne was talking about when we look at the business practices. If we look closely at where firms are drawing their power from, we've confused it a bit. Firms that have had a lot of data have gathered a lot of power, but has that really been the source of their power? And is that an ongoing source of their power? And what does the trajectory look like in the face of emerging practices and general emerging strategies, including responses to regulation? So rather than being power, data might be liability. And we've seen some of this before when we think of rules around, say, intermediary liability. This is when platforms and similar companies can be liable for content that is held on that platform. And sometimes, in that context, those companies have had an urge to hide their head in the sand, like this ostrich, and to try and avoid looking at what might be illegal because it could come with cost implications, even if laws protect them in many cases from being directly sued. So we find that they are concerned about law enforcement access, concerned about intelligence agencies, initially in the United States and particularly the Five Eyes countries, but now more and more across the world, making requests using warrants for data that is held. And when these requests are legitimate, they do create a lot of costs for a global platform company which specializes in selling its product with very low marginal cost to many different jurisdictions and not customizing it each time. It adds friction, and friction is anathema. Friction is poison to a platform company. Customizability per jurisdiction is poison because they operate on a model of scale and automated change, automated deployment. Also, a range of recent European law, such as the Digital Services Act, contains provisions around research access to data. The Digital Markets Act contains provisions around competitors being given access to data under certain circumstances. There are content moderation obligations, regardless of whether you have been aware of data before, aware of content, and therefore these are more proactive. And you also have security, cybersecurity, and privacy and data protection liability from holding data that could be sensitive. So data, rather than being power, is also a source of liability. Now, a question that arises from that is, can you have your cake and eat it? Can you effectively make use of data, have all the things that data brings, because data is not the end, it is a means to an end. And what is the end to which data is a means for? Can you achieve it without accruing this liability in the middle point? So when we look at Apple, a company that famously, repeatedly puts on billboards, puts on keynote speeches, phrases like this: Apple will not see your data, we are private, we cannot see your data, we keep things private, we cannot see them, we are restricting ourselves. Why are they doing that? In part, some people would say because it's a selling point, but also these same people say that people don't care about privacy, and that privacy is something they click away with an accept button. So while there certainly is a benefit to branding yourself, there are deeper business reasons to this. Deeper business reasons such as not creating the kind of bureaucracy that is designed to respond to those legal requests, to try and reduce the liability in your own company, and to reduce the risk of any kind of crisis or reputational damage that could occur from this. And the reason that Apple can make these claims without losing too much in the way of functionality and business share is because they can undertake analysis without data access. Many companies can do the same. And this initially sounds a bit paradoxical for those of you who are not well versed in what Corinne mentioned, privacy-enhancing technologies. But these are quite old technologies in many cases, and they've also come with a lot of political ideals, political visions about how they could be used. And in many cases, they can be used for pretty amazing things. I'm certainly not an enemy of privacy-enhancing technologies. But a technology can be used in many different ways, and good building blocks don't always make a good whole. So here's some vocab we might need to continue. And I don't expect you to remember all of this, but I think it's quite useful to reiterate it. Just as in, for those of you who sort of were going through the growth of discussion of machine learning in academia about 10 years ago now, you will have seen a million presentations about what algorithms are, what machine learning is, and so on. And maybe this will be the first for some of you of a million presentations of pets and privacy-enhanced technologies. And for some of you, it will be the umpteenth, 20th, 100th already. And I can see some of those people in the audience. So terms that are important: edge computing, bit of an old term actually, or local processing. Local doesn't mean around the corner, it means on your device. And this, in general, I'm given really loose definitions here for all these things, so please don't shoot me. Doing more of your calculations on the device rather than on someone else's device or in the cloud. So doing at what we would call the edge of the network. If you imagine a big network, and the middle contains sort of the big computers, and the edge contains our things in our pockets. Doing it in the pockets, not at the edge. And that's very much aligned with some of the thinking around the internet, around the importance of the edge rather than the center of the network. And privacy-enhancing technologies, or what I sometimes call confidential computing, which is a term that industry created but is actually more apt, and it's often used to describe a certain type of hardware, but is more apt actually sometimes and more well-fitting for what some of these technologies do. There is a subset of privacy-enhancing technologies that deal with analyzing data. So many things are pets. Ad blockers are pets. Tor is a pet. End-to-end encrypted messaging is a pet. But we aren't always thinking about those in what this presentation is today. There is a subset that is about analyzing data, or privacy-preserving analytics, or confidential computing, focusing on understanding something, acting upon the world, or building an analytic result without seeing or leaking or moving around much of the data that is used to create it. Some of the technologies here include differential privacy, particularly local differential privacy, where each device adds some little bit of noise before it aggregates in the cloud. And that little bit of noise means that you can make mathematical claims about how much you can learn about any one individual from the data that was aggregated, ideally being very little. Secure multi-party computation. This is where phones or computers or other devices, sometimes servers as well, they kind of replace the need to put data together with communicating encrypted information, quite a lot of the time. It's like passing a note around and everybody writes a single little number on, and in the end, you get an end result. The idea of this is you replace pooling of data with a certain kind of communication that comes with assurances that you can say, actually, nobody learnt about my information, but we did get the shared result. It's a bit of black magic. You have to trust me on this, because also most cryptographers just trust other people on this as well. These are some of these are quite almost magical technologies in the way that they work, and we just have to suspend belief about the claims about them. Secret sharing. That's when you take a piece of data and you smash it, make a jigsaw out of it. You give two people the jigsaw, or two or more, and they have to come together later if they want to rebuild that data. So you put it in one or more places, and as long as those organizations or servers don't work secretly together, you can make claims about how much people are actually learning. And lastly, federated learning, which is not always a privacy-enhancing technology, but can be. And this is about lots of devices which all have a machine learning model on them. They use their local data to improve that model on their device, and then they communicate information about the type of improvement they made to a central server, which can pool together those improvements and make one big improvement. And you can do this, it's possible, with some claims about privacy. So if you're careful about the information you send about the model update to the cloud, then you can make claims and say, well, these people have all helped train our model, but we never took their data. We only took the general insights from their data, which didn't reveal anything specific about them. So federated learning is not always privacy preserving, but can be. Okay, so with that, those building blocks in place, we can move on to look at some examples. And some of these will seem not just boring, but maybe quite positive. But I wanted to give you an understanding of how the companies that Corinne mentioned are deploying some of this in the wild today, and what that might say about how they might deploy in 4-5 years' time. Software and device monitoring being the first. So I will tell you that most of your computers in the room will be doing these technologies, by the way, quite often. Browsers like Safari and Chrome report information about the websites you visit to a central server using a form of local differential privacy, depending on the implementation. Google publishes a couple of protocols of this, Rapport, Proclo, about just things that may be quite good, like which URLs crash the browser or which use loads of battery. And they want to say, we're not collecting your web browsing history, even though Google's business has largely been based on this for the last 20 years. And instead, we are just learning about how to make the browser better. And Firefox has a similar thing with tracker blockers. Are our tracker blockers working? So they can build information that helps the developers. And you do need to do this, because if you deploy a software system completely in the dark, without knowing if it's working or not, there are things that you become hard to develop, and therefore non-privacy preserving developers might win in the market because they have more information about how their software is being used. And this relates strongly to work by Joris van Hoboken and Seda Gursis called Privacy After the Agile Turn, which looks at the connection between software development practices and information gathering practices. And this is a bit of a response to this, where you say, we're trying to do agile development, which is a certain kind of software development, without compromising privacy. So this seems pretty positive, unless you disagree with agile development, which is a different discussion for today. But I don't think many people disagree with this being something that is a sensible thing to do. Language. So we've looked at software, now we can look at language. Apple and Google both use different kinds of privacy-enhancing technologies to improve their mobile keyboards by looking, for example, what new words are people using in different languages. And what kind of dialects are they using? What kind of emojis are linked to these different words in every different language, and what is likely to be predicted after a certain sentence? So when you type on your phone and you get a prediction of a word, it is the result of a lot of this processing. Google uses this to say, what text are you selecting? So if you use an Android phone and you highlight text, it will often highlight maybe an entire address or an entire sentence that hopefully it thinks is the right thing you want. It does this using these technologies. Message auto-replies, these kind of weird Gmail predictions you get at the bottom, which are always like, yes, that, you know, they're like, would you like more work? And they always say, yes, that's great. Yes, please, more work. Oh, yes, I would love more work. And then you get 3 different options, all of which are the same. Whether it works or not, they're also based on this. And speech speech assistants are based on often federated and a new word that Google came up with called ephemeral learning, which says we delete the data immediately after we train it in the cloud. So it's not actually very privacy preserving. It's just a very cynical way to do this. But there is also a lot of effort on increasing and improving speech systems like voice assistants using these technologies. So the understanding of language gets a bit more invasive, right? It gets to questions about who has the ability to deploy language technologies in the world, particularly about minority languages, particularly around dialects which might not be spoken or have much written material, but maybe are used quite a lot in informal conversation and messages and so on. So people don't know, but when you write anything in a note on iOS, in the notes thing, if it's a new word it hasn't seen before, it will kind of flip a coin and add some noise and send that new word to Apple. So that kind of thing is happening on people's phones today. So let's move to environments. Apple has technologies called iconic scenes. So to build their memories function in photos, they try and understand in which locations do people take photos of which kind of things, sky, people, bridges, whatever. What kind of is a popular photo people take in a certain park? Is it of dogs? Is it of their friends having a beer or whatever? And they aggregate that in a whole database they have about the world and then use that just to try and give you the appropriate album cover for a photo album they've algorithmically created called significant locations. But you can start to see we're building databases about the environment, about the world we live in, that they are claiming involve no personal data being transmitted, and therefore, in their view, fall outside of much of data protection law, if not all of it. They're not really right about that, but that's a different point. Popular times. So when you go on Google Maps, you'll see, hey, this business is popular at 6 p.m. Apple Maps claims to have a similar function, which isn't implemented, but it is in their licensing agreement. And that also is using this similar technologies to understand when people visit certain businesses or search for them or how long they stay there. So you get information about environments again and how we move, travel, and exist within them. We can look at people's attention spans, advertising, targeting, what ads should people get. Google released a set of technologies called Privacy Sandbox, which they're deploying bit by bit in Chrome in different areas and different parts of the world. And that has different functions, such as we will not give all of your web browsing history to every single ad tech provider in the world, which is the current method. We will instead store it all in the browser, and the browser will select adverts for you. The browser will build behavioral models, which could be, in theory, very detailed, and will target ads on you, will show you the same thing you've looked at before in a shopping basket you never finished, but this data won't leave your browser. So it's turning their business outside in. It's effectively the same business model, but sucked into the browser.
2 more minutes.
Yeah, I've got it. And measurement as well. Advertisers love to measure their things even though they don't get this. And Meta and Apple are working on this quite a lot. Apple, you can also see, have a lot of different technologies and patents for attention, about timeline generation and user models and so on. And so what we can see here is that privacy is being used as a way to deploy different kinds of technologies, but these don't have an obvious link to confidentiality. They're actually doing quite a lot of things in the world. The idea that these are confidential and don't share any data doesn't say anything about whether they're good or whether we want people to use these technologies. We could, for example, see a situation where Apple is asked by, say, the Saudi Arabian government to locate all of the hidden gay bars in the country by cross-tabulating people's maps history with their search history on device and just producing a list of where all these locations are. And they would say, hey, we didn't give you any information about people. We just gave you information about the environment. So it's quite clear that you can ask ethical questions about what you do with this data, as well as how you, say, experiment on people and change their use of a device to learn about the world. And this is because data can be swapped in some circumstances for the ability to orchestrate devices, to make them all update and twinkle at once, and produce a shared protocol. And as Corinne said, you have different players in this space that have different abilities to look at this. So you've got some that are more infrastructural, so undersea cables, internet service providers, payment services, and some that are more programmable, following Seda Gers's work and Martha Poon's work and the group as well at TU Delft, some of which are in the audience. At the top, you have things like websites, super easy to program, but not very infrastructural. Now, this space in the middle, you have things that are quite deep in the stack, but are quite easy to change. Operating systems, mobile devices, cloud computing, browsers, and so on. These are a space where you find these technologies being deployed. This is the kind of assets that technology players can use to effectively deploy and to replace data with orchestration by making devices do the same thing. So my last slide just wants to set the scene to ask about governance challenges. There's problems with this for governance, and hopefully something we can discuss in the room. Sharing data is different from running code. Devices are largely going to be the same across jurisdictions, and you can't just share one country's data or one region's data in the same way when you think about making a device run a certain piece of program. If a government says we want this functionality, these devices, to produce something for the public interest, well, they can't just change the devices in a single area of the world. Network effects bound this, and they expand to the size of the network. So it's very difficult to turn that logic around, to let many people have a bite of this information and this ability to create it. There are practical issues. Security, if you let anybody run code on these devices that isn't the platforms, they will say, you will compromise our cybersecurity. They will particularly say you will compromise our battery life. If you have 200 programs running in the background on a phone from many different countries, it will eat all the battery on your phone. So there is a sort of scale limit to the efficiency and effectiveness of local processing in devices in people's pockets. These kind of technologies require baking in at the design stage. They're not like data, which you can repurpose many times afterwards super easily. They do require this infrastructural change, and companies will not bake in functionality that threatens them unless they're forced to. So you can't often retroactively ask questions about the past without changing the infrastructure that was doing those calculations. There is different kinds of opacity, so it can be quite hard to ask questions, for example, about advertising and discrimination if everything is held on the device and devices are not looking at whether job ads are targeted to men or women or people of different ethnicities with a different percentage. Bodies that set these protocols, standards bodies, they're not used to big value-laden decisions. Not that kind of body, and so they struggle to answer questions about ethics and so on. If a government intervenes, say they want to use these technologies for public health, like COVID contact tracing, for example, there's questions about under what conditions they can. If governments can always intervene, then intelligence agencies will want to unpick the encryption that protects content. And so we've got questions about what parts of government can intervene, which governments, in which situations in a global system. And lastly, NGOs struggle because they're so used to defending encryption and privacy. That was back when it was about protecting content and confidentiality of communications, which seems like a very laudable aim. Today, it's about configuring power, computation, and analysis of the world. So they'll struggle because it's hard to reason about this and hard to make those kind of claims in a nuanced way with technologies that can be so complex. So thank you very much. There's some more that you can read, including the video with Timon Kent, who's in the room as well, that was mentioned earlier on, and you can find that link here.
Thank you, Michael. So before I give the floor to you, I have one question for both speakers, and then you can ask your question. So I'm a bit somber. You're both quite hesitant to offer solutions, right? And especially Michael was very good in pointing out that none of the obvious solutions will work. So we can't aim for local devices. Because we need global, we're dependent on these few manufacturers of globally operating devices. Infrastructure is in the hand of a few behemoths. If government starts to intervene, it's probably not for the good because they will want loopholes for security services. So what possible strategies can you think of how to get out of this hold, this power grab of the few big behemoths?
It is indeed super hard. I do think that we both pointed towards a strategy, which conveniently starts with academics. So nice that we can keep at least ourselves employed tonight. But on a more serious note, I do believe that having this perspective be a regular part of conversations about infrastructure is a real start. And as someone, again, who's a reluctant academic and who co-founded and co-chairs a collective of public interest technologists who work on precisely these issues, right? Who were some of the people that I interviewed who were so frustrated about the fact that their normal repertoires weren't giving them the same results anymore or weren't giving them results across all of the axes of the problems that they had to deal with. And I will say I have a lot of faith in their ability to work around this, because these are people who come together around these issues from technical perspective, from legal perspectives, from social perspectives. And I think that is what it's going to take. It'll take a lot of interdisciplinary work and it'll take a lot of trial and error. And at the same time, we have to be really realistic about the head start that these companies had, what you very nicely called a regulatory vacation or a regulatory holiday of 15 years. ahead of the problem now manifesting very much in our faces. And I think it's even more than just a regulatory holiday, right? It's just been not as visible. It's been a holiday in terms of have got an advanced start along many ways, and catching up in some of the ways that the EU is proposing right now, like building our own cloud infrastructure. I just don't see how that is practical or possible. But I don't want to be somber or foreclose the opportunity, but the power that we're dealing with here is it's very David and Goliath.
So I think the solution, insofar as anything can be solved, insofar as politics can be solved, firstly, there has to be quite a lot of reconfiguration of the political economy of both technology, but also the politics of technology within governments in order to open the space for any solution. So one thing that needs to happen, I think, is you have companies like Apple that have built themselves in incredibly vertically integrated ways, and they resist modularity, they resist splitting up their organization, adding friction to the way they develop or letting other people develop on their platform at quite a deep level. And they'll say that's because of security. But that's also nonsense, because you can redesign an entire technology stack that can be secure but can be more open as well. It's just that company is incapable of doing it due to their own cognitive limitations. And and cultural limitations, particularly actually of that company. So,
Can I just add, I really like the word you use, the word friction, the way you use it, because usually friction is used by graphical interface designers to remove friction when signing up. So usually when I use the term friction in my outdated data protection vocabulary, it's no friction means no privacy, because they take away any incentive for user intervention. But you give this term a whole new meaning. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, so I think if you add that kind of modularity and opportunity for negotiation within a whole software stack, then you can slightly slow the development process. You can add processes of participation and discussion when something is rolled out, when one of these new technologies are rolled out, which allows them to be influenced by other players. Now, the flip side of that, right, is that, okay, sure, development becomes slower and becomes more negotiated and more messy and political, but these things are political, so we have to have a messy and political response. The flip side of that is that, as we see at the moment in cases in Nevada, but also in changes in law in the UK, many intelligence agencies, but also some communications and lots of child safety advocates as well, really want friction in development so they can veto encrypted communications. And they would say, you shouldn't roll this out without us having a huge period of massive legal challenge, which can delay this thing indefinitely. And so UK law is proposing changes to the Investigative Powers Act, which would allow kind of vetoes of Meta encrypting its services and so on, which already exist to some extent, but not enough as much as they would want. And so that requires the other side of the piece, which is the reduction of the power of the intelligence agencies within countries in comparison to other public interests in technology. Because at the moment, the reason why people say we can't get the state involved is because by the state, it means overwhelmingly the intelligence agencies, of which there are very few counterpowers to within the state. We could imagine a world where that was a bit more balanced, and we actually have integrated human rights in a more balanced way and have those discussions more openly. But we require the institutions to do that, and those have to be institutions which can discipline intelligence agencies, which is an incredibly difficult task. But we find this already. So in the UK, many government departments rely on GCHQ for their cybersecurity expertise. They have the National Cybersecurity Centre within GCHQ, and we are a country in a very strange position where opposition political parties take official advice on cybersecurity from the incumbent intelligence agency. Not like anything with the UK, not a design you would recommend for other countries, to say ever, but it occurs. And this is also in part because those are the places where the expertise is held. So there's a mix, right? There's the political side and the expertise side, And so we need to get that kind of upskilling in government. We need a politicization of technology within government where people can say, oh, the health department has views on this that are as legitimate and as powerful as the intelligence agencies and are more balanced. Now, that's a huge ask, but I only think if we do that, we can start to govern technology through our democratic institutions, because at the moment we have no democratic oversight over the main governors of technology within the government, in the West anyway.
Thank you. That helps. Who wants to ask a question? Just say your name, please, and there will be somebody with the mic. Thanks.
Thank you. We are in Amsterdam. We have the Waag, and she wrote the book, The Internet is Broken, but we can repair it. What I remember of one of the pictures she mentioned, and also what you were talking about, the government perspective, the business perspective, and she's mentioning when you're missing and lacking the human perspective. Put it in the middle, force it by law that they have human-centered communities. They have a say in what they're producing, what is collecting, everything.
Thank you. Is it addressed to Corinne or to Michael? To both?
Thank you for that question. So I'm assuming that you're talking about the digital commons work of the Waag. And I think it's, I mean, in a political and economic situation where there would be any kind of incentive for companies to actually take that on board, these are all wonderful aspirations. The problem, however, is what is your stick and what is your carrot to get all of the citizens in the municipality of Amsterdam to move over from Twitter to whatever open source equivalent we would be building. And so while I think we definitely need these kind of incentives because we need that collective vision of how we could be doing it and how we should be doing it, I don't think even the Waag considers this to be, you know, the way to counterpower in the current reality of big tech. Because what will Google do when we come to them with this example, right? They'll be like, that's cute, that's nice, you do you in Amsterdam. We haven't really seen anyone leave our platforms because the services that we provide are just so comprehensive. And the other concern that comes up with building an open source software stack, which again is a laudable thing to do, I'm not saying we shouldn't by any means, is that we don't have a good answer to the question of what cloud computing infrastructure will this run on. And so what you see, and this is a conversation that I've also had and been able to have with the Minister of Digital Affairs of the Netherlands, where my main question in a panel of experts with her was, even if we build the perfect stack and we get all of Amsterdam and subsequently all of the Netherlands to only use this stack for all of their digital needs, but we don't have an equivalent, an open source equivalent of a cloud that we can run it on, we're putting all of this taxpayer money into building this open source stack, and everyone who is part of this open source stack will subsequently pay the bill to Amazon or Microsoft or Google, naming the big threes. So what does that lead to? You get this really weird incentive where, because of the reality of the political economy of tech today, there is no outpacing some of these companies, right? There is no way around them. And so you take public money and you put it towards a good goal with good parts of it, and eventually some of that money ends up in the back pockets of AWS and Microsoft and Google. And this is a problem. Again, I don't have a good solution to this because I don't think it is easy to build a European equivalent to what they offer for obvious reasons. But this is the reality of sort of the limitations that all of these important initiatives will inevitably run into, given the reality that we live in.
You want to add, Mike?
Very, very briefly, I can. I just see an extra problem, which is that a lot of this infrastructural power and the potential for it is built in, say, to phones at a much earlier stage, and the consequences become apparent. So, for example, Apple will build advanced sensors and chips designed for this into phones many years before they even announce they're doing anything with them. And so the point of intervention where you might want humans to discuss the possibilities, is one which requires huge amounts of foresight, like technical foresight, into the potential use of technologies which are literally being developed in a proprietary way, very secretive way. And participation in those situations, I think, is not really feasible. I think it's barely feasible if you think about what can we use your data for. If you say, what could Apple's neural engine in a phone enable or disable in the world of digital power forwards? It does need to be a bit more technocratic than that, I think, which is a shame. And we can have moments of intervention, have translation points, and we can have views of what technology should do for us that they are a mandate to work towards. But I don't think we can actually solve this with participation, because you'd have to have a time machine.
Thank you. But I'd like to give the floor to somebody else. Sorry. Yes, please, in the back.
Oh, yeah. I am Elstak, and I wonder this: how can governments safeguard that we are not in the same position as the citizens in China today?
Thank you. That was a very concise question. I don't think the answer will be as concise as that. The surveillance society. Michael.
Yeah, I think this is about, it's very difficult with these kind of technologies because they're not the traditional idea of surveillance as looking at what you're doing, but they're the idea of surveillance as disciplining you. So in the same way as when you're in a supermarket and you might take something that will beep as you leave the store, it goes beep, beep, beep as you leave, the supermarket isn't collecting data on you. You're just walking with something that actually has a computational effect as you leave the building. So when we see these technologies, they are capable of trying to shape our world, shape the attention we have, for example, censor certain content if you do recommender systems or advertising on the device, and they're quite difficult to oversee. So the balance we have around China is that we are stuck at the moment with many people see that these companies are the protectors of human rights and privacy because they often are quite adversarial to certain kinds of warrants and interests, while they historically have also given in to other kinds. They're a mix of a safeguard, but also a choke point or a point where governments can access data. And so we have to play with that balance because that's always going to be the balance of regulating the internet.
Joris, did you want to add to that before I give the mic to Corinne?
Oh, I can go after.
Yes, please.
I appreciate the question. I'm always really hesitant to engage with these kind of cultural dichotomies, especially as someone who has never been to China, doesn't speak Chinese, doesn't really have a real grasp of what's going on there, taking my lead only from people in human rights organizations that I work with who indeed bring up this issue around surveillance quite frequently. But I want to be really careful about making this a global north versus global south thing, or we're doing it so well in the Netherlands versus look at how awful China is kind of thing, because we see bad surveillance practices across the world. And I think it's really easy to make sort of strawmans and enemies out of other regions as a way to not look at like, oh, how do these dynamics play out in contexts where perhaps the rule of law is much better. But still, there are reasons to question surveillance. I mean, I always joke, I lived in the UK for many, many years, even though my accent doesn't quite reflect it. But that was the worst surveillance state I've ever lived in. I mean, London, I swear to God, every 3 square meters, there is a camera and it's constantly watched. And actually, the municipality in the city of Amsterdam, and both Maxi Gas and Niels, who are in the room from the Critical Infrastructure Lab, know much more about this than I do, where they are experimenting with really intense surveillance that include sensing around particular areas of the city where a lot of people gather, and they're trying to sort of reframe this as this positive kind of crowd management control. I mean, we have an IoT bridge in the middle of the red light district that does something similar to this. And these are all things that concern me. So for me, whenever I'm asked to comment on countries that I know nothing about, I'm wise enough not to do that, and instead point out the flaws that I see in countries that I do know something about.
Joris, please. Oh, you want a short comment? Yes, please. But briefly, please.
Yeah, briefly. But if we speak about balances, then Corina showed that the balance can be disbalanced very easy.
The balance can be unhinged quite easily, yes.
As it can be here, as activists who work for Extinction Rebellion here also get lifted out of their beds for activities that are essentially not illegal. So again, like, I understand that there are contexts where things are much more severe given a different set of rules and regulations and protections. But I don't want to go down that line of essentializing an entire country that I just don't know enough about to say anything about.
Fair enough. Joris?
Yeah, okay. Oh, wow. So, Joris on the mic. Okay, so I'm Joris. I'm also here at the University of Amsterdam. And yeah, definitely also very interested in the topic. So I just feel like that maybe some of it is you're kind of falling for a particular kind of narrative and also interpretation of the law that is very kind of industry serving. I'm a little bit worried about that, and I maybe want to bring Shura and her data protection knowledge also into the conversation here. So to me it seems like there's this question of, I mean, one of the main kind of data-centric laws, or at least it's being very much interpreted as a very data-centric laws, is what we have with data protection. And data protection is protecting fundamental rights in like mediated environments, information-mediated environments that have become very individualized, so that they capture a lot of like data that relates to people in different kinds of ways. Now, and I've been quite interested in kind of thinking that it's kind of saying it's wrong to focus on the data, but the question is whether you can actually interpret data protection law that is not really about the data but about the power. And I think personally it's possible, and that's also maybe an invitation to Shura to maybe speak a little bit to that. So I want to mention one project that I supervised. It was a PhD by René Mailleux, who's also an environmental activist.
It's becoming a life philosophy.
Yeah, no, I want.
Sorry.
It's really, his project was about the right to access personal data.
Yeah.
And so the thing is, though, a lot of companies are going to say this data is not personal data. You know, like it does. And Michael, you were just answering this question, saying you're walking out and this thing is just beeping because some computational process, but it's not really tracking you or something like that. But if you can, I think, interpret data protection law that this data is very much, there is data very much processed in a way that relates to you. And so it triggers all the kind of protections of data protection law. So I do wonder if we shouldn't also be quite invested in making some of the tools that we do have, legally speaking, do interesting political work.
Well, good point, and I love a bit of bravado for the GDPR. So I agree with you that many data are personal data before they are encrypted or anonymized or dehydrated or de-identified or privacy sandboxed. But we do have a gap in our legal protection, and that is what I find the most interesting about the approach from both Corinne and Michael, and that is we don't have protections against group profiling. And this is what the big platforms are exploiting to the max. They do these, for example, the federated learning of the cohorts in the flocks in the privacy sandbox. They add a bit of noise, ensure that it's no longer personal data, create a group profile, but in the end it's back in your face as a targeted advertisement for some interest they inferred about the group you belong to. And I'm afraid it's usually quite spot on because they have so many data that they can still show you personalized advertising and personalized manipulations or orchestrations even on your device. I'm afraid we just miss enforcement means for this middle phase for the group profiling. And so that would be my personal regulatory recommendation to also look at this group process. And just final sentence for me, but I've been negotiating for these super strict privacy-friendly contracts for the use of enterprise services, not for consumer services, unfortunately. But we always include these prohibitions. So Microsoft is not allowed to use any personal data for big data analytics or profiling or marketing, but there is an inherent conflict of interest because we want Microsoft and the other, I just mentioned Microsoft, but all the other big techs, to use some of our data to improve the services in a technical way. So we always include a kind of a loophole where we allow big tech to process some personal data for improvement purposes and allow them to anonymize some data, for example, to predict energy usage of certain services, which we always also badly want from a sustainability perspective. We want to know how much CO2 impact these services have. So there's a difficulty in closing the door, even when you're negotiating from a very strict GDPR perspective, for this further use in anonymized or encrypted form, which allows these things that I'm a bit scared about, like using all of my locations on my device to predict what my favorite city or monument is in my photo album. I feel really uncomfortable. I wish I had a way to refuse that.
So thanks a lot, Joris. It's a really good point. And I thought I was quite careful to say that data protection also sort of applies. And the reason is I don't have much of a problem with saying the material scope applies. I think you can make that claim, particularly, as Shira says, when it's living as a group profile, it might not apply so well, but when it comes back to apply to somebody at the other side, it does again, and then at the same point at the beginning. Although you do have some questions around, which the court has never dealt with, around controllership without any controller who can see the data. And it then becomes a difference where the law is not set up to govern standard setters or the infrastructure. You have problems where the rights don't make so much sense with the way they're written. We can do that re-envisaging work, but maybe they're also not always the right rights that you need at that moment. Maybe they don't apply at the right point in the cycle. At this point, accessing data on your device, okay, that's portability and so on, but what right do you have to negotiate the higher level purposes that these data are being used for once they go through an anonymization phase? Or if you're going to then say the whole thing is one processing operation and it's controllership, you then get the challenge that is when is standardization controllership and when and that's a really hard thing to navigate. So I've written about this a little bit in 2 chapters that are online as preprints but not the books yet. There's one called Rights for Those, I forget the name of the chapter, it was the last thing, Rights for Those Who Unknowingly, Unwillingly and something else compute. In a book that Hans Miklas is putting together. And one of the biggest laws that will have this effect, actually, is e-privacy law, because that's so broad that really applies even to local processing. And so,
I'm going to cut you short.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm going to take 2 more questions, and then we're finishing the panel here. So please raise your hand. Yes, in the back, please. Who else wants the last chance? Okay. Sorry, Niels, thank you. You're the last one, yes.
So I think in tech there's a saying like US innovates and the EU regulates. And in the context that is being said is that the EU at some point, so right now the EU is a large enough player that they can regulate and still these regulations will apply or will force these large companies to do anything. But is there a point where this might not apply and the EU really regulates themselves away as a player and then we can come up with lots of laws to ensure the privacy of their citizens, but the companies at some point say, well, okay, then we do not play the game anymore. Is this a realistic scenario or are there ways around this?
Really, really good question. So for the things that I am concerned about, which again is not the current model for how internet companies make money online, which looks at consumer privacy and data protection, the EU has no chance of regulating the problem anymore, right? Because we are so beholden on these infrastructures, and we have been, because 15, 20 years ago, these were the content delivery networks and the cloud computing companies. I mean, that's when they started, and we are now all very reliant on them. And one of the things that I've seen come up again and again is this question of, I mean, obviously the EU takes these steps, and at the same time, we are saying, oh, we want to regulate the US technology companies, but we're also going to build our own national champions. We're also going to try and develop an EU cloud locally. So there's all of these conflicting dynamics happening at the same time. And I think we need to be really open to seeing that when we talk about what is it that the EU is doing, because there is not necessarily one singular approach. And you're right in saying that, like, this is a popular framing around what they're doing, but they're doing many things, right? They are also heavily investing in our telecommunications infrastructure to try and, like, give them a spot within this larger tech industry. Germany and France, in the last moments of the conversations about the EU AI Act, said, oh, no. We all of a sudden have these two equivalents to OpenAI called Aleph Alpha and Mistral, or something else that to me always feels like it comes out of a comic book. And so now we actually don't want these rules to apply anymore that we so desperately say we want to apply because we are the EU and we apply regulation, except we don't really want it to apply to our national darlings. So there are many things happening here at the same time. In addition to the fact, and this is not something that I mentioned in the talk, but that I've done research on in different contexts, is there is a real interest, actually both in the US and in the UK, and to a lesser extent also in Europe, to start applying anti-competition law, and specifically to the AI sector and cloud computing. And the problem is that even if these regulatory approaches are something that you can feasibly and quite rapidly deploy, they might, again, they don't solve the problems that I am worried about. Because if you say, oh, well, the problem in the cloud computing industry is that we have 3 big behemoths, we should have 30, or we should have 300, or we should have 3,000. To me, as someone who's, for instance, concerned about the environmental impact of these cloud computing companies, you don't solve that particular problem by saying, we are the EU, we're going to break them up into 3,000 companies, because now we equally have to deal with an environmentalism problem. So there are real urgent reasons why we should take up all of these different ways in which there are tensions between the different goals that we're trying to pursue here, especially because they also internally chafe at each other, right? The EU gives money on the one hand to things that on the other hand it tries to regulate. So this is not a singular thing. And I think being really open about the fact that all of these tensions and contradictions exist is important in our conversation about it.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. The last question is for Niels ten Oever.
Thanks so much for this really stimulating new way of looking at technology and power. And maybe this is a bit of more of a meta question. We regularly say, it's not the data, it's the data flows. It's not the data flows, it's the data structure. It's not the data structure, it's the infrastructure. And we continue, it's not the data infrastructure, it's the ownership, it's the territory, it's the topology. And so, and of course, we're academics, we need to publish new things, so we can explain it like that. But how are we following things that happen? Is this a cat and mouse game? Is this increasing our understanding of how datafication works? Or are we the blind people that are touching the elephant and slowly finding different parts? What are we doing when we are working on technology and power and technology critique the way we are doing it now in an interdisciplinary way? So this is part of that interdisciplinary process. Where does this lead us? How can we, what are we doing?
Thank you, Niels. I'll give the floor to Michael first, and Corinne may present the final, hopeful conclusion, I hope.
It's a really good question, Niels. I think that mean, to some extent, I think what we're doing is we've blurred a lot of these things together before. Corinne said it very well, and now we're trying to split them out, and it's becoming clearer about what are necessary or sufficient conditions for exercising power. It's also these companies don't have a sort of secret room, right, where they all kind of go, ha, we've got like a really secret underlying plan. They are discovering new ways to wield power slowly and over time too, and also feeling the elephant in a different way. And I think that is maybe it's not a cat and mouse game, one's outrunning the other. We're just both trying to like understand ways power can be wielded in the digital world with different aims. And so what does that say about where we have to go from there in studying it and thinking about intervention points? I mean, we have to be a lot more creative, I think. The way that platform companies have wielded power has almost been like magpies, when they pick up lots of little sparkly things and they put them in a box for a later potential use. When Google is a great example of this. Google is a company that wields power at a distance, like at arm's length. It tries to open source things. It lets other actors have a lot of say in stuff while retaining a lot of overall advantage from that behavior. And so they're quite comfortable with that compared to Apple, which can't let anyone in or let any other chefs in the recipe. So when Google does that, I think they are putting their fingers in a lot of pies and involving themselves in a lot of standards, and then later on bringing together a narrative of how they can use this in order for business ends, which is also why they kill a lot of products, right? Because they could have been powerful, but they weren't. So I think we also have to try and study this in a much more fluid way. And I'll finish by saying that Julie Cohen does a great work in her book, because she just sort of has that question of power, and she sort of says there's no point making a list because there'll be another way to do it. We can try and understand it in a more general way, but when we think of technology and power, it has to be a more open-ended way to think about it. And I think that's how I think about it, but we need a strategy rather than, I guess, a taxonomy or typology.
I'll be brief, although I do love a quintessential what on earth are we doing here question, and I appreciate that, Niels, especially to close off with. So my answer is twofold. Yes, there's definitely a lot of chasing the hype, and I think in many ways academia is set up in that way because we are all chasing money from funders, and funders also chase the hype, right? So you get, I mean, I've gone through the big data and then the AI and then all of these hypes. So you reframe your research to be able to do any kind of research at all. And so academia in that way is fundamentally broken, right? There is no such thing as I will truly sit down, deeply think, not have to worry about how to get that finance or how to get my group finance. So that is one part of the problem here, is that, like, in an ideal world, we would have an academia that functions very differently than it does currently, especially given that so much of the money that we're getting at the moment is corporate money. And while they have often said, oh, this comes with no strings attached, even if it doesn't on paper, it tends to implicitly. And obviously, and I've seen this actively in some of the places that I've studied at and worked for, they will literally say, well, we will pick the weakest critic and we will fund them. And this happens. And that also means that our focus, like you said, is a bit all over the place and is a bit scattered. And some of that I want to put on us, the academics. Some of that I want to put on the larger context in which we're trying to do a good job here. And the second part is I do think there are people in the room who have a really comprehensive picture of what's going on here. I'm very lucky to be working for one of those people. So definitely watch this space.
Thank you very much for your great questions, and an applause for our two brilliant panelists. You've done a great job. I want to conclude that we are still confused, but at a higher level. So thank you.
Or a lower level.